All right, let me just move this to the side. All right, can everybody see this and hear me?
Yep. Thank you, Josh.
Okay, so hi everybody, I'm Josh Grelewicz. I'm a grad student at UC Davis, and I'm really looking forward to sharing these very preliminary results on the effects of occupational licensing on undocumented immigrants. So they're partially preliminary because I haven't had the chance to show them to occupational licensing researchers. So I'm really looking forward to people's comments. Okay, so to motivate, there's almost 8 million undocumented immigrant workers working in the United States in 2017. So for context, that's about 5% of the labor force, but almost around 30% of the immigrant labor force. So this is a group that's quantitatively important if immigration is something that you're interested in. It's also a group that's important if you care about the economics of economically disadvantaged groups, right? So, for example, despite living in the United States on average 10 years, undocumented immigrants face a relatively flat age earnings profile. So as they gain labor market experience, that isn't reflected in their earnings compared to native workers or other immigrants. And so one reason that's put forward to explain this in a recent paper by Boris and Cassidy is occupational immobility. So once you control for occupation, kind of this gap in the age earnings profile slope decreases. So this makes sense, I think. So one of the central barriers for undocumented immigrants in the labor force, right, are legal barriers to work or their work status. And in particular, there's been a lot of research looking at different policies that affect the work status of people not legally present in the United States. For example, some papers have looked at the large amnesty that occurred in the mid-1980s for undocumented immigrants arriving before 1983. Other papers have looked at states that require employers to carefully check employee social security numbers. And of course, there's been a lot of research on the 2012 Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals policy, which granted work authorization for a number of undocumented immigrants that arrived to the United States as a child. So far, there haven't been any papers that look at the effects of occupational licensing on undocumented immigrants. And so that's what the kind of contribution of this paper is. So for some context, of course, we know here that occupational licensing is sort of this important labor market institution. So, somewhere around 25% of the workforce is licensed. And this is, as we've seen throughout the literature, associated with the wage premium. And there is even some evidence that the premium may be larger for immigrants. And so if I'm interested in the evolution of immigrant wages over time, I think licensing as a barrier to work in certain occupations is a great place to look. And in particular, I argue that licensing is uniquely restrictive for undocumented immigrants. And so some background on this, since welfare reform in the mid-1990s, it's been illegal, or states have in general been not allowed to grant undocumented immigrants occupational licenses. So in particular, this act barred undocumented immigrants from receiving benefits from the states, and it defined occupational licensing as a benefit. And so sort of the combined effect of this policy is that undocumented immigrants were after this unable to obtain occupational licenses if they were, assuming that they're already able to obtain them. So the same law, incidentally, also required all license applications to include a social security number as part of a separate policy to use sort of the threat of withdrawing licenses as a way to enforce child support payments. And so that's just this is sort of a way to operationalize how undocumented immigrants were prevented from obtaining licenses because undocumented immigrants don't have social security numbers. And the exception that I'm going to use in my identification strategy is that the same law permitted states to grant benefits in law if they explicitly pass legislation allowing undocumented immigrants to obtain a certain benefit. And so that's the sort of variation I'm going to use to see the effects of these restrictions on undocumented immigrants. And so my research question is, are these occupational licensing constraints binding for undocumented immigrants, right? So obviously undocumented immigrants face a lot of legal barriers to working in the United States, not having work authorization, not having social security numbers are all very important. But at point of fact, as I showed on the first slide, about 8 million undocumented immigrants were working in the United States in 2017. So the question then is, if those legal barriers of not actually having work authorization isn't really binding or doesn't prevent undocumented immigrants from working, do these occupational licensing restrictions do those prevent undocumented immigrants from working in a given occupation, and do they affect the labor market outcomes of undocumented immigrants that choose to work in those occupations? So I kind of break this down and this question down into two steps. First, given access to licenses, would undocumented immigrants obtain them? So this is sort of my first stage. The second stage is then, does this lead to some effect on wages or occupation choice? Okay, so in this paper, I examined this question using a 2014 California law, which gave undocumented immigrants in California explicit access to licenses. And so I'm going to use just a difference in difference methodology using a couple different data sets to estimate first the effect of this reform on undocumented immigrant licensing rates. And then I'm going to turn to economic outcomes like wages and employment in various occupations. And so when I do that, I'm going to use the measurement or the measure from the 2019 Kleiner-Saltis paper that we've seen a lot this weekend of licensing intensity to estimate the effects of this reform on wages and employment. So to preview my results, first, I find that licensing constraints do appear to be binding for undocumented immigrants. So after the reform, I observed that licenses granted to people I impute to be Hispanic increased 10 to 15% relative to non-Hispanic whites in my kind of administrative data that I'm using. Then I turn to the CPS data that we've again seen a lot this weekend, and I find that self-reported licensing increases among undocumented people I impute to be undocumented about 1.7 percentage points, or about 30% off the baseline. Then I turn to these wages and employment in various occupations, and I find that comparing the sort of increase I think it's better to really explain the identification strategy when I get there on this one, because it's a little tricky. But I find that there's some increased intensity of wage response to my treatment in more heavily licensed occupations. So that's the sort of empirical strategy I'll be using there. Okay, so for the contributions, first, there's this literature that looks at the effects of occupational licensing on immigrants. And so there's a number of papers that look at this. And so my paper is the first one to specifically focus on undocumented immigrants. And so I think this is important for a couple of reasons. First, undocumented immigrants, as I've kind of discussed. So the key thing is that I think this is a margin of the effect of licensing that we don't often look at in the licensing literature. In particular, I'm looking at the effect of licensing policy, where the policy is to explicitly ban one group from access to licenses. And so it's a different margin than, usually we compare licensed occupations, unlicensed occupations. I'm looking at the effects of banning a group entirely from obtaining licenses, which, so in that sense, I think this work is most similar. Well, I think that's enough to say about that for now. The other reason I think this is interesting is because of that sort of variation I'm using, I think there's a misallocation story here where you have a misallocation of talents between undocumented immigrants in licensed and unlicensed professions. And so I'm not going to talk about that much today because I'm still working on the data, but that's another reason I think that this is a particularly interesting context.
Josh,
yeah.
Bobby has a question. It's what is the general skill set of undocumented immigrants?
Thank you for your question. So on average, it's lower, right? Lower education levels. I think it's a younger group as well. So in general, the skill set is lower. And so this paper I cited before, the Borjas and Cassidy paper, actually finds that the controlled, once you do like an adjusted wage gap between undocumented immigrants and similarly skilled and educated other immigrant workers or native workers, that the gap isn't so big. But what is the big difference is really the change in the profile. So for example, controlling for occupation may not make sense if undocumented immigrants don't in general have access to the same occupations, if you're worried about these outcomes. But it's a great question. I probably should have a summary table with this information at some point in here. So the second sort of contribution along these lines is that it helps to explain sort of this flat age earnings profile, because I kind of will show to some extent that this policy matters both for wages and also for employment in heavily licensed occupations. And so this third one, may need a little bit more explanation outside of explaining it at UC Davis, but in general, in the immigration literature, there's not much evidence of effects of immigration on native workers, right? So there's not a really strong, robust effect that the literature has found of immigration causing native worker wages to decrease. And one of the kind of postulated explanations of this is that there's some complementarity of immigrant and native worker. And so one reason that immigrants and natives may not be fully substitutable is if there are legal barriers to employing immigrants in jobs that native workers work in. And so by showing that there is this restriction on that substitutability, I'm helping to explain the observed complementarity that other studies have found. And so the second sort of area that I think this is contributing to are these papers that are concerned with the distributional effects of occupational licensing, right? So there's lots of papers that show that are concerned with these efficiency concerns, but there's also another literature that's looking at the effects of licensing on African Americans and immigrants and other disadvantaged groups. And so in my results, I find that access to licenses increases wages and employment for a fairly economically disadvantaged group. And so my interpretation of that is then that licensing, as it's been implemented in almost every state, has been harmful to undocumented immigrants, right? Okay, so I'm not going to talk a lot about the different theories of licensing here, just for time concerns, because I always run out of time on this presentation. But I'll just say that kind of given the bulk of evidence in the literature that I've read, my mental model for thinking about these is really the first kind of regulatory capture framework. When I'm thinking about the effects of these policies, I'm thinking about licensing as being a barrier to entry for undocumented immigrants, more so than these other these other theories, which are interesting, but may not be as relevant in this context. Okay, so here are some recent policy changes that are kind of important in this context. So this isn't comprehensive. I think these are from the National Council of State Legislatures. So after DACA was enacted in 2012, there was a concern for a lot of people that despite having work authorization, DACA recipients weren't able to work in many licensed occupations because of the earlier law I referred to. And so a number of states started granting undocumented immigrants access to the state bar or the teaching profession and other professions. So the policy that I'm going to focus on is this first policy in California which granted undocumented immigrants access to a wide swath of licensed occupations. And the kind of crucial distinction between this policy and sort of the rest of the state policies that we can see is that most states only expanded access to licenses to DACA recipients. And so California is unique in expanding licensing to all undocumented immigrants who have an individual taxpayer identification number. So some document they use to pay their taxes. And so that's why I'm going to focus on this California policy because it turns out that DACA recipients are a pretty small share of undocumented immigrants. Okay, so let's talk a bit about the policy. So this was enacted around the end of 2014, and it was and boards had to be compliant by 2016. And so the bill prevented the California Department of Consumer Affairs from discriminating in giving licenses based on immigration status. And it allowed individuals, when they apply for licenses, to use an individual taxpayer identification number instead of a social security number when they apply for licenses. And so this is a document that's used by many undocumented immigrants to pay taxes. It could be used to obtain a driver's license, and it may be useful at some vague point in the future if there's some future amnesty law that it could be used to prove residency in the United States. And so I think use of these is fairly common. So some representative boards and bureaus that are kind of under this legislation: accountancy, barbering and cosmetology, automotive repair, security guards, all the medical boards are covered, and the Bureau of Real Estate is covered as well. So there's a number of so it's pretty expansive. Basically, it covers a number of licensed occupations. Okay, and so now I want to just go a little bit more over the timeline of this legislation, just so that I can argue a little bit more forcefully that it represents a natural experiment. And so it kind of started in the end of 2013 when Sergio Garcia was denied access to the state bar based on his immigration status, or really misrepresenting his immigration status on his law application. And so he appealed this decision, and the Supreme Court of California basically referred to the earlier policy that I referred to, that states cannot grant licenses to immigrants or undocumented immigrants unless the legislature explicitly allows it. And so they turned to the state legislature, and within a month, the California legislature passed a bill allowing undocumented immigrants access to pass the state bar. And so a year later, this policy that I'm looking at was passed. And so this law, my argument is that this law was intended to make business law consistent with this earlier reform. And so I'm arguing that, the earlier reform seems pretty random. It's just one person was applying for a license, and the Supreme Court essentially allowed it. And now the policy that I'm looking at, when you look at oral arguments about the law in the legislature, a major theme was that it was to make the business licensing law consistent with this earlier amendment for lawyers. And so this is sort of my argument that about sort of how this law came into being.
A clarification question, Josh, from
Sure.
Wen Chen. When your definition for undocumented immigrants is that they have ITN, but not SSN, and are
So,
they unlawful immigrants in this sense?
so if you have an ITIN number, so you can have an ITIN number and not be an undocumented immigrant. But if you're an undocumented immigrant, you can obtain an ITIN number. So I'm not defining the ITIN number as being something that defines an undocumented immigrant, but the ITIN number is what allows undocumented immigrants to obtain licenses under this regime. So when we get to my empirical strategy, the way I define undocumented immigrants in the data is pretty messy, but that's sort of a feature of any research that looks at this group. And so, but thank you for your question. Okay, so now but before I get to really what I look at, I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of the mechanisms and why this policy matters. So why would a license matter for an undocumented immigrant worker if you're already working illegally, right? So why does the legal right to practice an occupation matter if almost by definition your practice won't be legal, right? And so there's sort of two channels I'm thinking about. One is that licensing access helps immigrants that are already working unlicensed in an occupation. So the occupation I have in my mind when I'm thinking about all of this is barbers. I think it's a common plausible occupation. So one big thing is it eliminates the risk of citation from licensing boards. So you don't have to face a fee. And so because you're not worried about that, you're able to work more openly, helping you develop a clientele and working more flexible hours, right? And so another thing is that it may provide training or signaling value. Okay, so I don't think there's a lot of evidence for this one, but it's a theoretical possibility. The other mechanism, right, is that a license allows an immigrant to move into an occupation. And so these are my two channels that I'm thinking of. If you're already working in the occupation, you're better off from having a license. And if you aren't working in it currently, you're able to move into the occupation. And so I'll be able to sort of look at how important these two are. So here's just some kind of textual evidence from, I think, the LA Times of accounts of undocumented immigrants that were affected by this policy. And so I like this last one. I told myself I will no longer have to run every time the State Board of Cosmetology comes. They charge a $1,000 fine for working without a license, right? And so the $1,000 fine comes up a lot, and it's actually a $1,000 fine for both the individual and the firm. And from talking to kind of stakeholders, I understand that in practice, the employee is usually on the hook for both $1,000. So it's kind of an interesting example of the economic incidents not matching up with the statutory incidents, that the worker can often be stuck with a $2,000 fine if they're caught working without a license. And so this is the occupation switcher channel. So these are some testimonies from people who basically in their home country, they worked as a barber or a beautician. And when they arrived to the United States, because they don't have the proper licensing, they were unable to work in their sort of chosen vocation, right? And so these are the two kind of channels that I'm thinking about. All right, so first what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at this question of my kind of first stage, right? Does access to licensing for undocumented immigrants lead to undocumented immigrants obtaining licenses? So the first thing I'm going to use is this data on licenses granted from the California Department of Consumer Affairs. So this is on their website. They have these spreadsheets. I think it's the same general type of data that was used in some papers, some of the papers, I think, by Harrington about Vietnamese manicurists. I think it's the same data set. And I'm going to use this to estimate difference in differences estimator. So I'm basically going to compare the number of licenses granted to people I impute to be Hispanic compared to white, or people I impute to be white, or non-Hispanic white specifically. So these are matching up with the kind of standard census definitions. And I'm going to be comparing before and after the policy change. And then I'll do as much robustness as I can, right, to try to see how robust these results are. And so a little bit more about this data. So there's 47 boards and bureaus represented. The data contains the name of the licensee, the type of license, like barber license or manicurist, the status of the license, the date when the license was initially issued. So that's very important. And when it expires. And then there's also very kind of pretty rich geographic data for where the business is located, which I'm not even using that yet. So at some point, I'm hoping to start using that data. And then what I do to get at this race and ethnicity is I use this Python package, which basically imputes, or it predicts, the ethnicity of either Asian, non-Hispanic Black, non-Hispanic White, or Hispanic using the name data. So it's like a neural net that was, well, if there's questions about it, I can kind of show more details, but it's just it basically breaks the name up into a bunch of little 2-letter chunks and uses those chunks and like machine learning to predict the ethnicity of the person whose name it is. And so it's pretty good. It's pretty accurate. All right, so there's some summary statistics of this data. So I have by this imputed race, the various, some of the important occupations we might think about and how common they are for each race. And so the thing that was sort of shocking to me was how common security guards are in this data. There's a lot of security guards, especially among Hispanics and non-Hispanic Blacks. So this is generally what the data looks like. So I restrict my sample between 2010 and 2019.
Josh, we did get several questions come in.
Okay.
First from Brian Meehan, does the California Department of Consumer Affairs data include licensing denials?
That's interesting. So like people who applied but didn't get them?
I believe so, yes.
So what's interesting, so this data I'm using doesn't include that. But so one set that I'm working on cleaning right now are the license exam pass rates for the Department of Barbering and Cosmetology. So I can see, at least for that board, I can see exam pass rates. But in general, I don't think there's just, actually, now I'm thinking about it, they might have that in aggregate. I can check the aggregate because they give you like a spreadsheet of all the individual data, and then there's also sort of aggregated statistics they generate. And so I can take a look. I don't think that's directly available though.
Then Ilya asks, do you know how well your algorithm predicts ethnicity? Have you done any checks of that?
So I haven't done it. They have a paper that they use to describe it. I think so. Their accuracy, they say, for the so their out of sample accuracy, I think, is 80% for Hispanics, and I think it's also pretty high for Asians. So I think predictably it does a better job with Hispanic names and Asian names because sort of typically use different languages, whereas the language is more ambiguous for the other two groups. So it performs really well though, especially for Hispanic names or names.
Bobby Chung asks, is it more useful to compare California with other states? A concern he has is that there may be a nationwide trend of Hispanic employment wages.
That's a great point. I'm you know, I'm worried about those trends, and I'm also worried about sort of demographic changes as well. So I think that's really one of the big empirical challenges. And so I will, for my later regressions, I will be comparing across states. But within this data, I will do what I can to try to control for like linear trends and things like that. But it's a great point.
And just one more, Josh, and then I'll let you proceed, I promise.
Thank you.
Ting Ting asks, do you know who used the ITN SSN to apply for the license in your data?
I don't. That's something that I've tried to get from the boards. And basically what they tell me is that, because in theory, they could tabulate that themselves because the ITIN numbers have sort of a different format, a slightly different format than the Social Security numbers. So they could do that if they wanted to be more helpful, but they have not so far. So I've actually talked to, I've talked quite a bit to somebody who owns a beauty school and tried to see how much they could help me, because they also have that kind of information. But it's, they're obviously people who own beauty schools are kind of busy right now. And so but yeah, it's a great point. So I am working on that, but I'm not too optimistic about being able to get that data. But thank you. Okay, so here's the basic picture that describes my thought experiment, right? So this is just the trend in new license applications over time by my imputed race or imputed ethnicities. And so sort of the assumption is if I can make some argument that the parallel trends assumption holds, then the sort of difference in the growth rate, maybe I can interpret as a treatment effect, right? And so the first vertical line is the date that the policy was enacted, and 2016 is when it was required to be effective. And so this is sort of just a representative graph for barbers. Okay, and so here's more kind of specifically my empirical specification. And so I regress some outcome, which in my baseline specification is going to be log licenses granted for a given occupation or license type, race, and year-month cell. So I collapse all my data down to the race or ethnicity, occupation, and year-month level. And I regress the log number of licenses on occupation fixed effects, ethnicity fixed effects, year fixed effects, month fixed effects, and then I do this sort of difference in difference. So pre-post reform and an interaction of that with the various races. And so the excluded group is non-Hispanic whites, and so all of my coefficients are relative to non-Hispanic whites. And my standard errors I cluster at the license type level. And I'll talk a little bit about how I've experimented with seeing how robust it is to different specifications. Okay, so here's my baseline event study diagram. And so this one I think looks pretty all right. And so it doesn't appear to be a clear pre-trend before 2015 or 2016. And then there seems to be an increase in licensing for Hispanic licensees relative to non-Hispanic whites. And so these are log points on the left-hand side. And so here's a bigger table where I show just the difference in difference estimates for a number of specifications. So that graph corresponded to column 1 here, where I just take the log and, I deal with zeros in this first column by adding 1, which is, it is what it is. And the row you should focus on is this Hispanic interaction with enacted row, which is the second to last row in this column. And the coefficients across these different specifications, I think, look pretty similar. So in the second column, instead of taking the log of the outcome, I divide by the per capita population for that specific ethnic group or race, and I don't take the log. And so in the next column, I exclude this sort of ambiguous period where the treatment may or may not have been occurred. I do a Poisson regression with accounts. I do a hyperbolic sine or inverse hyperbolic sine as another way to deal with the zeros. And also I just tried deleting the zeros. And so none of this really makes a big difference, except that the key thing is in column 2, because my demographic data is at the yearly level, I can only run that regression annually. And so that reduces my number of observations by quite a bit. But in general, I think that, again, this is very preliminary, but I think the pattern, at least in these regressions, is fairly consistent. And so these are some other things I do is the pattern looks the same, like the event study looks the same if I restrict to just manicurists, barbers, and cosmetologists. These stuff I talked about. And then I also include a linear time trend at the occupation race level, and stuff looks, and the regressions look pretty good when I do that too. And so that's where I'm at with this right now. But if there's any comments about what you think would be a more appropriate way to use the data or specifications that you would like to see if you saw this paper, then please let me know, because this is my first time showing it to the licensing people, right? So I've shown it to a lot of immigration people more so. And so please, I look forward to your comments.
On that account, Josh, I do have 2 comments from the group chat. First, Bobby says it would be useful to compare ethnicity statistics tabulated in the CPS and ACS, getting at Ilya's previous comment. Mm-hmm. And then Bobby also asks, do you look at new issuance or just the total stock?
So that's a great question. Those are both great questions. So the key thing is they're all new. They're all newly issued licenses between 2010 and 2019. And so I'll say, so I haven't really represented exactly what the data is right now. But my sense is that the kind of flow, the flow data is much better than the stock data, because I think if you were licensed a long time ago and your license expired a long time ago also, I think you might not be in the data. So for example, the Harrington paper with the Vietnamese manicurists, I kind of tried replicating it, and you don't see nearly as many manicurists, just because I think the data going back is not as good. But I think that's much less of an issue if I look at just the newly issued licenses since 2010. I don't, at least at this point, I don't think that's a big issue. But so that's why they're all the flow measure right now. Thank you. Okay. And so these weaknesses, I wanted to be transparent. I showed you the event study. I showed you the best event study, right? So, but in particular, I think the rest of them look okay when I do the event study with these different specifications, but except for the Poisson. The Poisson looks pretty bad. And so that's why I don't focus on interpreting that one too much, because just for whatever reason, there appears to be a pre-trend when I do that regression. Okay. So then I look to see if the results are consistent across data sets. So I have these results where it looks like, there's between a 10 to 15% increase for Hispanics relative to non-Hispanic whites after this period. And so now is when I turn to the CPS data. And so I'm using this data, which we've seen now a number of times. And I'm going to do a similar sort of exercise, but now, like I think Bobby said, I'm going to be using between state variation as well. And I'm going to show you 3 different types of different diff, including a triple different diff. So first, I'm going to compare the licensing rate for undocumented immigrants in California versus other states. Then I'm going to compare undocumented immigrants versus the rest of California, so a within state comparison, which is similar to what I just did. And then I'm going to do sort of a triple difference in difference using both comparisons. And I'm going to focus on this third one for a reason that will become apparent in a minute. So here's the licensing questions. Again, I'm running a little short on time, so I'm not going to talk about them too much because we've seen them so much, right? So in general, I consider somebody licensed if they answer yes to they have a license and it was given by the state. But I also do robustness to requiring them saying yes to the third question. And the results are even stronger when I use the third question. Okay, and so imputing documentation status. So this is something that I really need to do more robustness on. But as a first pass, I impute as undocumented foreign-born non-citizens from Mexico, Central, and South America who arrive after 1980, right? Because if you arrived before, then you would have received amnesty under the Immigration Reform Act. And so I also do some robustness to only including Mexican immigrants, but this is an area where I need to do a lot more robustness. Okay, so here's just some summary statistics by my imputed documented versus undocumented, and this is actually a sample where I restrict to just like working age 18 to 65, I think. And so the key thing I want to focus on here is that by any of these measures of licensing, the licensing rate is much, much lower for undocumented workers. And so, yeah, that's the key thing there. And so I already said that. Okay, so here's the actual specification. So I'm just going to do a regression of, it's a linear probability model where I regress being licensed on state, year, and occupation fixed effects, a bunch of some controls for age, education, and gender, and then this diff and diff where I compare California versus other states, and well, the three different comparisons I showed. And I'm going to cluster my standard errors at the state level. This first column is when I'm just comparing undocumented immigrants in California to other states. And so interestingly there, you don't really see really much of an effect in this specification or in this way of cleaning the data. In the second row, I do the similar experiment as I did before, comparing Hispanic workers to white workers, and in this regression, you see sort of this a fairly large effect, and then I do the triple difference in difference in columns 3 and 6. And so the reason I like the triple difference in difference is that it admits this nice interpretation of the sort of amount by which the licensing gap closes between undocumented immigrant and immigrant workers. And so my interpretation of this 0.016 is that after California passed its licensing law, that led to a 1.6 percentage point reduction in the gap in licensing rates between undocumented and documented workers. So after California passed the law, the licensing rates began to converge between the two groups. And the one other thing I wanted to touch on here is that going from 1, 2, 3 to 4, 5, 6, I add occupation fixed effects. And what you see is that adding occupation fixed effects doesn't actually change the results all that much, but they slightly attenuate. And so my interpretation of that is that since adding occupation fixed effects only reduces the coefficients a little bit, I think we can interpret that as a lot of the effect being driven from changes within an occupation, right? And so a lot of this effect we're seeing is that people who are already working in an occupation are becoming licensed. And so my caveat I'll say is that I need to do the stuff that I think from the Kleiner and Zhu paper that Morris talked about yesterday to clean this data a little bit better with respect to which months I use. And so this, I would say, is more as a way to confirm the other data set, which I think is a little more reliable at this point. But, okay. And so robustness, so I do it a few different ways. I do the different licensing variables, and it's robust to that. I restrict the states with the most undocumented immigrants. Instead of defining, I change my definition of undocumented immigrants, and instead of using all people as my control group, I can also just restrict my control group to natives, and it's robust to that. It's not particularly robust to restricting my control group to other immigrants, which kind of makes sense because, again, when I'm imputing immigration status, I do that sort of noisily, right? So it's sort of how it's done in the literature, but I have to assume that a number of people that I impute to be undocumented actually are legally do have work authorization, and at the same time, many immigrants that I don't impute to be undocumented also in reality are undocumented immigrants. And so it's not totally surprising that using other immigrants as a control group it's noisier, right? So it kind of makes sense. So just to kind of summarize these results, there appears to be, at least in these preliminary results, a fairly large and immediate effect of this licensing reform of, on licensing rates among undocumented immigrants. So for my first question, I kind of I think there's pretty strong evidence that there's a first stage here. Okay. So then I turn to the second stage, which I think is a much more difficult question. And so what I'm trying to do now is look at the effects of obtaining licenses or having access to licenses on economic outcomes for undocumented immigrants. And so, the standard approach you see a lot is using changes in licensing laws or comparing licensed and unlicensed occupations. But as has been discussed by many of the papers that use this data, many occupations are licensed at levels below the standard occupational codes, right? So things like acupuncturists or professional kickboxing promoters are licensed in California, but they do not have their own occupational codes. And moreover, there are many occupations that may be partially licensed. So for example, if you do contract work at a residential versus a commercial property, or if you're an accountant, and moreover, enforcement may vary between states. And since I'm looking at a population where almost implicitly there's going to be some amount of non-compliance with licensing laws, I think the strength of enforcement is pretty important in this setting. And so that's why I think using this Kleiner and Saltis method is or measure is appropriate. And so that's what I do. So using the CPS data, I calculate the fraction of workers in a state occupation pair that claim to have a license. And so I treat this as like an intensity of treatment type setup. And my prediction is that you'd expect more heavily licensed occupations should be more affected by California's licensing reform. So just to get a sense of this data, again, I know a lot of people are familiar with it already. Here are these licensing rates by state for registered nurses. And so it's pretty tight, right? Most of them are around, or they're all between 70% and 100%. And there's not a ton of variation. If I turn to electricians, then there's a lot more variation, which makes sense because electricians, or somebody who claims to be an electrician, may or may not be performing the tasks that require licensing. And there's also state variation in licensing laws, where in some states licensing is administered at the municipal level. Okay, and so the question I'm trying to answer is, does this access affect economic outcomes? And I'm going to try to approach that using a triple difference and difference estimate. And so my three differences are, first, I'm going to be comparing California to other states. I'm going to be comparing pre-post 2016, and I'm going to be interacting that with this continuous measure of licensing stringency. And so you expect to see larger effects of this policy in occupations with the most stringent licensing. And so you'll notice I'm not interacting immigration status. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run this regression separately for undocumented immigrants and then native workers. And so what you'd expect to see is that there's some large effect for undocumented immigrants and a smaller effect or no effect for natives. And so here's just the estimating equation, right? So this is just what I said verbally. And so what we're interested here is beta 6, the coefficient on the triple difference. And I include occupation, state, and year fixed effects, and cluster my standard errors at the state level. Okay, so here's sort of the end result. So here's the coefficient on the triple interaction. And the sort of direct interpretation of these coefficients is that, within an occupation, varying the level of licensing by 1 or 100%, going from completely unlicensed to completely licensed, the increase in labor force participation, or the number of people working in an occupation, increases by, depending on the specification, between 20 or maybe between 15 and 30% for undocumented workers. And so the outcome here, just to be clear, is log number of workers working in the occupation. And so just to kind of go over what I do for robustness, the baseline is I define a person to be licensed if they have a certification or license granted by the state. For column 2, I use the stricter measure where they say it's required for their job. For measure 3, I drop any state occupation cells where the licensing share is estimated using fewer than 15 distinct individuals. So distinct people, not observations. For column 4, I'm just using the states with the most undocumented immigrants, or the largest share of undocumented immigrants in my estimation. And in column 5, I do I implement the empirical Bayes adjustment that's done in the Kleiner and Saltis paper to sort of reduce noise in this measure. And so across these kind of specifications, there's a pretty consistent effect of between 15 and 30%. So there's a lot of variance, but they're all fairly large. And the key thing here is that they aren't quite as large as they first appear, because remember, I'm estimating these, or identifying these estimates using variation within an occupation cell, right? So going between 0% to 100, both 0% license and 100% license are very rare in this data. And so the way I scale these in my head so far, right now, is sort of as a rule of thumb. If you look at these data, for example, for electricians, the difference in licensing rates for states with state level licensing and not state level licensing of electricians is about 20% in this data. And so I scale these by dividing them by 5 to get what I think is a fairly reasonable, to reflect a fairly reasonable amount of the variation in the data. But I'm still working on a good way of kind of quantifying that. So anyways, I look at employment as well. It's fairly similar, around 15 to 20%. And then I look at log hourly wages. This one's a bit more sensitive to my specification. But again, in some specifications, there doesn't appear to be an effect, but between 10 and 20%, I see across these specifications. And so when I run the same regressions on the native population, I don't see anything. When I restrict my undocumented immigrant group to just being Mexican immigrants, the results are even stronger. And when I restrict my control group to just being naturalized immigrants, there's they have a bit of an effect on other immigrants. So the treatment effect for naturalized immigrants or immigrants I don't impute to be undocumented is much smaller. So maybe it's a half as large for most of these estimates than what I impute for undocumented immigrants. Okay, so I think I'm just about out of time, and so those are the results. Thanks everybody for your comments. The main thing I want to look at in the future is I'm bringing in more data sets to see if there's some misallocation story where it looks like perhaps these undocumented immigrants who are getting these jobs are more qualified in some way than the native workers. And so there's this misallocation issue. But thanks again. I appreciate everyone's comments.
Thank you, Josh. And there were a couple other questions in the chat. Please feel free to take a look at those. We're going to take our first break. We will resume at, I lost my place here. We will resume at 12 noon with Dr. Alicia Plemons' presentation. I'll see you then.